All right, guys, we are going to talk here about feudal Japan, which lasts for a crazy long time. Japan is kind of in the Middle Ages from, the late 700s almost until the 1800s. So a long time that feudal Japan exists. Okay, so we've got the first period here in the 300s, the Yamato period. Basically, they're bringing across Confucianism, which is part of the philosophy in Japan as well. They're bringing across the Chinese language, which is those kanji characters that symbolize words that aren't like phonetic like we have. The Japanese also do have a phonetic alphabet, so they kind of have to put everything together. Buddhists start coming across, and then there's a big influence of Chinese art and architecture as well. Let's see if we can minimize me. Kind of there, the era of great kings. The whole island isn't necessarily unified. You've got a lot of different people that are controlling a lot of different places in terms of the island there. Bringing across the Chinese government structure as well. And that's coming from that kind of late Han period China. If you remember the Han's government, they're taking those Confucian ideas and applying them to the government. Kind of stuff there. Most importantly, to organize the government, they give the here Prince Shotoku, and he puts in this constitution, which is starting to give people rights. They're again starting to make some of that Chinese culture their own. They're really starting their own kind of Buddhism as well. All right, so the high period kind of Japanese culture here is the Heian period, which you read about. Really, really important. You've got these large estates run by these knights. You've got arts and literature. Some of the first novels and diaries are being published. Part of that is that you've got the government is kind of restructuring, and so people have to learn how to act in certain ways. And so there you've got the kind of government as well. And they're becoming more and more suspect of Chinese. Japanese have a great tradition of kind of having their own culture. And so, like, they wanted to get further away from the Chinese at this point in time. Again, so they've got some things coming. They don't take the civil service system, even though they take some of the government. They do take Buddhism, they take some of those print block styles, they take the Chinese writing, but they really still have a feudal system where people are given their rights based on, birth, and people are in a very strict kind of social hierarchy. They don't take the tests that the Chinese are giving. You can see there the Heian type of dress. You've got certain ways that you were supposed to look in that court. That goes with that Heian period and etiquette as well. There you've got the Pillow Book by Sei Shonagan, who's this high level woman in the courts of Heian China, and she basically writes all of these in her diary based on what the etiquette is. And so we know a lot about Heian China from the Pillow Book. And there's how do people dress, how are men supposed to act, how are women supposed to act, all the way through that. Tale of Genji, probably the first novel in the world. Story written by Murasaki Shikubu, a lady again, high court in Japanese culture. Um, you know, adds to this Japanese script known as kanja or kana, sorry. So those are the Japanese characters that are more like what we're used to. Those are a phonetic alphabet, and then the men are writing more in kanji. And so it's interesting that Lady Murasaki here is writing more in kind of a more Japanese style, where the men are really focused more maybe on that Chinese style. Here we've got the Kamakura shogunate that runs from the end of the Heian period through 1333. You've got the feudal society, you've got the emperor. Now, in Japanese society, for most of feudal history, they have the emperor, but the emperor isn't really important. The important person is the shogun who kind of runs everything. And then they give out the power and these big estates to the daimyos, and the daimyos then have these samurai that fight for them. Samurai that have lost their daimyo are called ronin, and they are kind of like paid soldiers for hire. Most people in Japanese society at this time are peasants. So they're farmers and fishermen. They're the people that are feeding everybody else. But underneath them are artisans and merchants. So it's like seen as more important to be producing food than it is to be like a craftsperson or somebody that's selling things. Maybe a little bit different than some other societies that we've talked about. So you've got an emperor, but he's not the one in charge. The shogun's really in charge. At times, you might have a lot of different daimyo in charge as well. And so that's that feudalism, very similar to feudalism in Europe in those days of castles and things like that. Most people are owing loyalty to different people. What do they get? They get protection, and they get land from these people, and then in return, the samurai owes its loyalty to the daimyo, who owe their loyalty to the shogun, who's kind of running everything. All right, code of Bushido. You need to be fidelity, so you stick to your one person. If you are married, you need to be polite. You need to be virile, so you need to have lots of kids. And it kind of needs to be simple. That's that samurai code, similar to maybe, the knight's code of chivalry in Middle Ages, although they're a little bit different in terms of how that works. If you are dishonored as a samurai or a daimyo or even a shogun, you are expected to take what's called seppuku or ritual suicide. And that's where you take your short knife and you disembowel yourself. So you actually cut open your stomach so your intestines and stomach kind of fall out. And a lot of times, what would happen is you'd have your second nearby you. So after you committed suicide, they would cut off your head. Otherwise, it would be really, really painful to kind of die through seppuku. It's one of maybe the reasons that in Japan there's still a lot of suicides today. There's a samurai in full attire. Samurais generally have a long sword and a short sword. They were very well made using steel techniques, which made them, hard and sharp. Samurai warriors didn't have a lot of defensive stuff, so they did have armor and things. But the real key in samurai warrior is to have that sword and to kill the person as fast as possible. And so there you've got the armor, and you kind of put the armor on, but basically people are like, there's not as much maybe defensive armor as there is in Europe. Most people, your goal as a samurai was to kill somebody very quickly. And there you've got, some of the armor and plate that's going in to maybe deflect some of those weapons. And the design was really important. So you wanted to have a very fancy design, and to show kind of who you were loyal to, and then also, to show that you could afford to have kind of cool stuff. So similar to feudalism in Europe in terms of how that worked, in terms of land and loyalty, very similar. And so there's the code of chivalry and how that's kind of similar to Bushido, maybe didn't have the faith. There you've got the samurai warrior versus the knight. The knight, again, is going to have a shield, where the samurai much more offensive in character. And there's the different kinds of armor. Zen Buddhism comes across. And so the Japanese take on Buddhism and Buddha's ideas, and they really make it their own in terms of Zen. And Zen reinforces Bushido, reinforces mental discipline. One of the things kind of unique to Zen Buddhism that might be different from other types of Buddhism is the way that they meditate. They meditate on what are called koans, which are kind of like these strange sayings. So, like if you've ever heard if a tree falls in the forest and nobody is around to hear it, does it make a sound? So that'd be a koan. Or what is the sound of one hand clapping? That could be a koan that somebody would meditate on. Like we just read about the Mongol invasions in China and how they take over Korea as well as China. During the time of Genghis Khan and Kublai Khan, the Mongols actually tried to invade China, but their ships are basically stopped and sunk by this big kamikaze wind that stops the invasion from Japan or from China to Japan. And so the Japanese see this as kind of like this divine wind that has helped Japan stay Japan and not be invaded by the Mongols, not even really the Chinese. All right, Ashikaga age, you've got these shoguns fighting for power, a lot of different things going on. The laws are really not very clear. You've kind of got like the Chinese, the Warring States period, where nobody exactly knows who's in charge. You've still got an emperor, but he again doesn't have a whole lot of power. It's not very efficient, but you've basically got the armies of these samurai that are going around trying to protect the people in the country, and really fighting with each other and stuff like that. And so there's Japan, and where all the different, kind of groups are um, located. What winds up happening is you do get some kind of trade, and because of the chaos, the Japanese aren't able to stop the Portuguese missionaries from coming in and kind of starting Christianity. So there's some castles that they're using to kind of defend themselves and defend the certain parts of trade, similar to kind of the medieval castles in Europe. Here we've got, after this kind of uprising, you've got all these different groups that are fighting each other during that age of Japanese medieval history. And so there you've got the warring states, you've got these big castles. More and more of the shoguns and the daimyos are controlling what's going on. The emperor has less and less power. Europeans come in, they bring weapons and firearms and Christianity and start to trade. Christianity becomes very important in China. Trade becomes very important, and the Europeans are really starting to be an important influence in Japan, similar to what's going on in China, and maybe like what we'll see later on with those opium wars we talked about last week. So finally, we get this guy Oda Nobunaga, who unifies a large part of Japan. And he is pretty skeptical of the Europeans and Christianity. And so you do have St. Francis Xavier, who's in Asia and in Japan as a missionary. But then you've got this guy, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, who becomes suspicious of the Europeans and their territorial ambitions. He doesn't want them to take over Japan. Says that all missionaries are expelled from Japan. He does try to invade Korea. That invasion fails. But one of the really important things is he kind of helps unify Japan, and he gets rid of those European influences. And the Europeans really don't come back to Japan, or even when the Americans finally open up Japan in the 1850s by gunship later on after that. There you've got the Christian Martyrs Shrine in Nagasaki, and so they were really powerful in those southern states. And the Japanese rulers actually killed a whole lot of Christians because they were so suspect of Christianity and these philosophies that were coming over from Europe at the time. And then you've got the starting of the Tokugawa shogunate, which goes kind of until the Meiji Restoration. Is appointed by the emperor. Really kind of talks about restricted members of the same class. You can only marry within. He's also forcing any of the daimyos that their family has to stay kind of with him in the capital, and that way he's controlling them and making sure they're not doing the things that they shouldn't be doing. Okay, Tokugawa shogunate, major period of Japanese history. It's closed off to all trade except for the Dutch, and they're only allowed to come like once a year, and they're only allowed to go to one place. Christianity is forbidden. We saw the martyrs there before. The government is really centralized. The shogun has all of these powers. Trade within the country is really good. Towns and these castle towns increase. The merchants become really rich, even though they're still kind of on the bottom of society. You get new kinds of art forms in terms of haiku and kabuki theater, and so you've got a lot of things going on in the Tokugawa period that are becoming, really advanced in terms of Japan. And again, this is kind of the last slide here, but Japan kind of maintains, samurai and medieval stuff all the way up until the 1800s, after which they really developed very, very quickly. All right, that is it.